Apache stories. And Apache stories, the driving force of Apache stories is to tell the real story of the Apaches here in Arizona and sort of the United States in general. We are guilty of misrepresenting Native Americans ever since white people came to this country. And we thought it was appropriate and proper for this museum to try to tell that real story of the Apaches and to end that story with that the Apaches are alive and well today. You know, they're not an anachronism of history. They're still very much here and proud and active. And this exhibition celebrates that and gives a proper representation. It deals with how Apaches and Native Americans in general are represented in film. There's no question that Hollywood has done a disservice to Native Americans in film for many years. I think they're finally doing far more accurate portrayals. This exhibition would not have been possible without the generous donation of the Cowboy Cookin' restaurant here in Wickenburg. So I always want to thank Cowboy Cookin' for that very generous support. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists today. Leading the way is our moderator, Dr. Eduardo Pagan, Professor of History at Arizona State University, and Adjunct Curator of History here at the museum, and a very well-known person, I think, now to all of us here. But we have two expert panelists joining Dr. Pagan today. The first is someone you may recall, and we've invited Marshall Shore, the hippest historian anywhere, to join us today. Our second panelist is Mr. Jim Swift, the owner of the Saguaro Theater, and without a doubt, an expert on Western films, and I'll say a very avid collector of Western films. So he's here to really share his impressions and opinions about how Native Americans have been depicted. So without further ado, I give you Dr. Eduardo Pagan.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Dan. Thank you for coming out today. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about Westerns, and we're going to talk about how Apaches in particular have been portrayed in Westerns. But before we do that, I want to just throw out this question, and I do want some answers. So, why do we love Westerns? Just collectively speaking, why do we love Westerns?
Horses.
Horses, all right, good. Did I hear something over here?
Good guys and villains.
Yes, good guys and villains, thank you. Clear storylines, yes. What else? History. Yeah, so some representations of history as well. Anything else? Action, yes, always part of Western. So it's interesting to contemplate what makes a Western a Western. How do you know that you're watching a Western? It's more than just the cowboy hats, right? It's the ways that stories are told. And to go back to what you had mentioned about good guys and bad guys, is that Westerns, generally speaking, have been our American morality tales. So many of them, I wouldn't say all of them, but so many of our Westerns revolve around the triumph of good versus evil. Now, evil can be portrayed in different ways. Sometimes it's the wilderness, it's the forces of nature. Sometimes it's bad guys, gangs, banditos, rustlers, corrupt politicians. Sometimes the bad guys are the American Indians. They're the obstacle to overcome. But many of our Westerns revolve around this idea that there is an obstacle out there and we need to overcome them. And the we can take different forms. Sometimes it's the community banding together against evil to overthrow it. Sometimes it's the lone man. Think of High Noon, the lone man who stands up to corruption, right? Sometimes it's that. But what's interesting though is, as I said again, I want you to think about Westerns in terms of a morality tale. It's the way that we like to talk about our collective past. Now, the interesting thing for me as a historian is that Westerns rarely represent the West, right? In fact, we have such, as Dan alluded to, we have such a defined way as Americans of thinking about the West that if certain elements are missing, it's not a Western. Horses, for example. Guns, action, and of course the ubiquitous cowboy hat. And I don't want to go down this road too far, but I just want to point out that if we could go back in time, the closest thing that we have are actually to photographs, right, of going back in time. You won't find cowboy hats the way we think about cowboy hats today. They look very different. To me, they look like small sombreros, quite honestly. And if you think about it, it makes sense. People working outdoors, you want to shade yourself from the sun. You want the broadest brim possible, right? So there weren't curling up of the brim or any of these stylistic things that we do today. You want to maximize protection. Clothing as well. I want you to know this, and we'll see this often as we go through these different films. Clothing, this is the West, as we think about the Old West, this is the Victorian era. The Victorian era, and the reason I'm pointing this out is because people coming out West brought with them Victorian clothing and Victorian fashion. And so the color scheme that you see often represented in the movies is often these earth tones, right, and leather. So the men are wearing all leather and the natives are wearing buckskin. If we went back in time, you would find very, very colorful clothing. You would find hats, all kinds of variety of hats that they're wearing back east as well, again, because people are coming from back east and bringing their fashion and their stylistic sensibility out to the West. And so it was far more diverse. It wasn't kind of the classic vest and jeans look that we're so familiar with, right? Even the boots look different, but again, I don't want to go too far down that. But let me just say one more comment, and here's where we're going to do this. So I wanted to say one more thing in terms of grounding Westerns in American history. Then I want to turn the time over to my friend Marshall, who will give us a larger context about Westerns, right? Indeed, about Westerns. And then we'll go focus down a little bit more on the Hollywood Indian. And I'm pointing to this case that's over to your left. And you'll see the movie poster for Geronimo, James Stewart's Broken Arrow. I think we might have Tasa, son of Cochise, in there as well. This is the way that most Americans have come to understand not only the West, but American Indians and Apaches. And what I find so interesting is that this is a period in Hollywood's history, this is a post-World War II period, in which it was very common to have leading actors put on brown paint and then play a character. So Burt Lancaster, for example, plays an Apache, same thing, but Rock Hudson, I love this one, Rock Hudson as Apache, right? It was very, very common to kind of do this portrayal of Apaches. Occasionally they tried to get it right, the filmmakers, in terms of maybe some gone dancers in the back, right? We had, if you were here at the opening of this exhibition, we had gone dancers over here on Frontier. Occasionally you'll see that out there, but more often than not, they will be these stereotyped or packaged representations of the Indian that we all think we know. And they weren't trying to be documentary. They weren't trying to represent the native peoples. So with that, I just want to show a few minutes of some of the earliest Westerns in American history. And it goes all the way back to the early days of Westerns. 1915s, 1920s. Thomas Ince was a producer and a director of movies. And Westerns are part of our movie-going experience from the very, very beginning. But what makes Ince really interesting is that Ince lived in the day when many American Indians were still struggling to live on reservations. And he actually employed native people to represent themselves. In fact, some of his earliest movies, he employed some of the survivors of the Battle of Greasy Grass. This is Custer's Last Stand. Some of those who were actually there. He brought them out to Hollywood. They lived out in Southern California on a little village he created for them. And he then asked them to perform. And they did perform in their own original costume, in their original dances. The problem with that, though, is that these are Lakota Sioux from the Midwest. They were not Apache from the West. They certainly weren't Navajo. I mean, the list goes on and on and on, right? But this was the beginning. On the one hand, again, I give them a lot of credit for asking native people to represent their culture on film. Great. But then it set up this idea that to be Indian is to wear the feathers on the head, the buckskin clothing. This all comes from Plains people. And if you know the Native American world, it was highly diverse in terms of how they did their hair, whether they actually had facial hair or not, some did, what they wore, how they wore it, wide diversity, particularly when we're looking at the Southwest. So yes, again, Thomas Ince, thumbs up for trying to be accurate in representing Native people, but he began this stereotype that all Indians look like Plains people, right? So I want to show just a few clips. This is a silent movie. So imagine you're back in the silent movie. We'll just show a couple minutes so you get some idea. And this one is Wagon Tracks. This is 1919. And there's a soundtrack to this. We want to turn that up as well. It's just piano playing. There's no soundtrack to that, okay. Okay, so you get some idea. And again, we're not going to watch the whole thing. You just imagine what it would be like to be in a theater and there's someone's playing the piano on the side and we're trying to lip read, right? But again, this is just one representation. And again, I give him a lot of credit for trying to be on location and filming. So many of these films take place in Southern California as a representation of the West. So with that, let me go ahead and throw it over to Marshall. Marshall, while you're giving an introduction, let me see if I can pull your
Let's give that a shot.
do you want me to take care of this while you're saying a few words of
Sure. I mean, it's like so good morning. I want to welcome you all. I mean, on this beautiful day, you're sitting inside. We're going to get a chance to talk about some Hollywood movies. Now, of course, I don't necessarily pick the Hollywood movies that I think are on the tip of everyone's tongue, and I'll explain why as we kind of go along. Now, actually, Wickenburg Western Films. Let's see what happens if we do that. Alrighty.
This one's a different software. So, Natalie, there's a way of seeing we can use his, I don't know. Okay, I guess the problem is a software problem, right?
Well, quick question. So HDMI connection to the system?
Yes.
Then why don't we just throw my laptop in and we
Okay.
can go from there.
All right. So we apologize for that for just a moment. We have different systems that are trying to talk to each other. Apple versus PC.
Shocking, during COVID, we're having tech issues? My gosh, we should be doing this on Zoom. Exactly.
Now, let me, now as Marshall is setting up, let me talk a little bit more about Westerns, about the way that we love to tell stories about our collective past. And what's interesting to me is that Westerns as a theme, as a way of talking about the past, as a way of telling stories, has transcended our past. And so Westerns as a genre have gone out into space and into sci-fi as well. So if you think about, for example, Star Trek, this is the original Star Trek, it was considered in its day a Western in space because of the ways that the stories were set up. The phasers shooting out, the shots. Star Wars, right? Star Wars, if you think about the character of Han Solo, the gunslinger, right? But even now, if you're watching on Apple Plus, if you watch The Mandalorian and also the Boba Fett series, they are so clearly Westerns in space, in a galaxy far, far away. True, a long time ago, right? But they're so clear. In fact, the musical scores for The Mandalorian, again, The Mandalorian is the gunslinger who is traveling and he has an errand that he has to do. And again, if you follow that storyline, it is so clear. In fact, what's interesting to me is how the Indian is represented in these Star Wars spin-offs now, The Mandalorian and also Boba Fett, right? But the last thing I want to share with you as we're thinking about this, what makes a Western, is the musical score. Think about all the Westerns, the great ones, even our television shows, Bonanza, right? They all have very iconic musical scores, the good, the bad, the ugly, right? You remember all the classical musical scores. That's the other thing about Westerns, is that it's the music that is being played that illustrates that we're about to enter into an epic story, a dramatic story, one full of passion and all the other emotions as well. Now, as we're talking about music, music is an instrument of storytelling, and particularly when it comes to Westerns. And when the Indian is represented in Westerns, you will often hear a different kind of musical score. You're all familiar with it, right? It's some variation of da 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 da, right? It's some variation of that, and you know then that the Indian is going to be represented. I want you to think about why. If you've ever been out to any reservation, I guarantee you will never hear that musical score. And yet, it has come to characterize the Indian, right? The presence of the Indian. So again, I share that with you of thinking about that there are types that are out there, stereotypes even, that we collectively have employed, and I just mean just all of us as American culture, in telling the story of the Indian, when in fact it has nothing to do with them. It's all about the ways that we talk about ourselves in the end. Here's one last thing I want to share with you. It looks like something is happening here. One last thing I want to share with you. I want you to contemplate for just a moment. When was the golden age of of Hollywood Westerns? You know this, Jim. What's the golden age of Hollywood Westerns? What's the time span that you would put to this?
Well, of course it would be the late 30s, 40s, and 50s before television.
Right.
Yes, the Westerns thrived at that time. And then, of course, all of that material, and some of it, unfortunately, the early stuff was even lost because people figured, the producers or whoever owned the movies, well, we're never going to watch this again. This isn't going to make us any money. And so it was abandoned. But it fed the television screens through the 50s, certainly. And I was glued to the television. In those days, I loved the Westerns.
Yeah. So thank you. So think about the career of John Wayne, for example. This is kind of, that spans the golden age of storytelling. What else is happening in the world during this time? And I'll turn this over to Marshall in just a moment. I should think about this, right? Golden age. So if you want to put it, say, 40s, 50s, 60s, all the way into 70s. Remember High Chaparral on television? I love that show. What's happening in the world during this period? Yeah, what kind of war? Second World War, and then afterwards? The Korean War, but certainly the Cold War. Again, we understand ourselves locked in this battle, this global struggle between democracy and totalitarianism or communism, right? Good versus evil. And this is one of the ideas that scholars have put forward for why Westerns were so popular in a period that coincided with the American Cold War, right? So again, just to think about that as in terms of context now, let me turn it back over to Marshall. I'm glad we got things working. Thank you, Natalie. A genius as always. All right.
Indeed, our tech issues may have been resolved. We shall see as we move forward. So my name is Marshall Shore. How did I get here? So a little over 22 years ago, I was in Brooklyn, working in a beautiful Carnegie building, and decided it was time to trade all that wind, that snow, that slush, for a little 1956 ranch house in the central Phoenix. Now my house is pretty much a time capsule. I mean, there's what my kitchen looks like today. All that buttercream yellow tile, in-the-wall oven with no window. So it makes baking quite an interesting challenge. Uh-oh, did I get too far? Oh, there we go. And so as soon as I got here, all I kept hearing about how there was no history. But I knew that wasn't true because every time I went somewhere, I kept running into so many amazing people, places, and things. And stories. Oh, so many stories. And then there's that post-war boom that I think in a lot of ways made the Arizona that we all know and love today. All those GIs that either were stationed here, trained here, or passed through on their way to somewhere else. And after the war, they were moving here in huge numbers, changing how we interacted. Now you might wonder, hip historian, what does that even mean? So, I get to play a lot with Arizona history. I get to do a lot of fun things. I'm also, right now, we're working with the Arizona LGBT Plus History Project, and I'm working on a book of LGBT history of Phoenix, which has been quite fascinating already, even 2 weeks into the project. I do a Once a month, we do a walking history tour of downtown, kind of haunted history. I'm so excited. I'm working now on a project with Casablanca, which is a mythical, real place in Paradise Valley that started off as an adobe structure in the mid-30s and has become now housing, condos. It's, I think, the most dense population in Paradise Valley. And it's got an amazing history that most people know a little bit and a lot of wrong things about. So that's gonna be the fun. During COVID, we started doing Arizona History Happy Hour, which is every Thursday night. And if you look at your calendar, guess what? Tonight is Thursday. So we actually have a special guest on, Candace Green, who is a school teacher who during the pandemic was roaming around the state, taking her students on virtual field trips, engaging them with history and stories across Arizona. Now, as we talk about film, you know, when I started kind of looking at this, I was like, you know, there are so many Westerns across the board. I mean, you have things like Humps, which talks about those camels going across that 35th parallel here in Arizona. And you know, for all the apple dumpling gangness of it, it actually gets more right than I expected that it would have. You also have El Topo, which is supposed to be one of the best Westerns ever produced. You also have Lonesome Cowboys, which is Andy Warhol's contribution to the cowboy screen. And then you have kind of that B, maybe even C grade, like the giant Gila monster. And then, so I love bad movies. And so Ed Wood, who knew there is a script that is called Ghoul of the West, which was unproduced, that would have been starring Bela Lugosi in a Western. And I did go online and I actually can get a hold of a copy of the script. So now it's like, okay, who do I entice to try and actually see if we can pull this off? Because that would be so much fun. So, but here in Arizona, there were so many locations that were used for film. You've got Apache Land, which is now started in the late 50s, and after 2 fires, multiple sales, and a huge fire or 2, the only buildings that really survive are really the barn and the El Charro Church that had Elvis Presley. So if you go, you can actually bring in your own Elvis impersonator and get married in the El Charro Church. So I grew up, see, I talk about being from New York, but I really grew up in Indiana, in a little tiny town. Now, where I grew up was in an interesting spot because it was a town of 25 people. About a half-mile away, you had the Shawnee Mounds, which were part of a farm, and they were just these mounds that were burial grounds. And not far off the river was Fort Weatna. And so every year they would do Feast of the Hunter's Moon, which was an event where they reenacted the French Canadians coming in. You had a lot of indigenous folks. So I remember as a kid sitting in a teepee with a grandfather telling stories of the old days. And it was so much fun, and that really has influenced a lot of what I do, kind of that interesting background. And then you have, say, a book like Little Big Man, that when it was written was considered to be kind of trash. But, you know, it then became a Hollywood movie. Now, like you had said, some directors said, hey, you know, let's get people who are indigenous to play roles. One thing I thought was interesting was, so basically, the lead guy, right up until the last minute, was gonna be various actors who were white. At the last minute, they all systematically bailed out. And then Chief Dan George took over the role and wound up being the first indigenous person to be nominated for an Academy Award. You had Dustin Hoffman, who is in the Guinness World Records, because in this movie he plays, I think it's a 122-year-old, reflecting back on his life about how he was basically an orphan and taken in by the Shawnee and raised. Now in the book, because it was written by an Anglo, he always said, as he would talk about the book, that he never assumed he knew. He may interact with that history and the community, but he never came from a place of privilege like he was one of the community. Then you also have Robert Littlestar. Today, that role was one of the earliest of what we would now call Two-Spirit that actually made its way to the cinema. Now, and then you also have Faye Dunaway, who plays a minister's wife and later on comes back as a prostitute. In a completely different role, but same person. And so when you look at this movie, it's not what you would consider to be your typical action-packed Western.
111 years ago, when I was 10 years old.
Between 1858 and 1878, Jack Crabb was an Indian warrior, a preacher's ward, a gunfighter, a drunkard, a hermit, and he tried to kill General Custer.
Take him away and hang him.
And you can believe as much of that as you want. Dustin Hoffman plays Jack Crabb.
Throw 3.
And he plays him for real. After real, after real, after real. And Little Big Man.
Dustin Hoffman, reel 2.
These were human beings, my son. And now they're dead. Rubbed out by those ugly, unnatural creatures.
Why would they kill women and children?
Because they are strange. They do not seem to know where the center of the earth is. We must have a war on these cowards and teach them a lesson.
Dustin Hoffman, reel 5.
You murdered! Got to cut your throat to get through your head. I'm a white man. White? Sure I'm white. Didn't you hear me say, God bless George Washington? God bless my mother. I mean, now what kind of Indian would say a fool thing like that?
Dustin Hoffman and Martin Balsam, reel 7.
You're improving, Jack. You just can't seem to get rid of that streak of honesty in you. The one that ruined you was that damned Indian, old Tiki.
You mean old Lodge?
He gave you a vision of moral order in the universe, and there isn't any.
Dustin Hoffman and Faye Dunaway as Mrs. Pendrake, reel 4.
You do realize, don't you, dear Jack, that the Reverend Pendrake is not altogether wrong.
What, ma'am?
Well, Jesus is your Savior. You do realize that, don't you, dear Jack?
Oh, yes. Yes, Miss.
Are you thinking of Jesus, Jack?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Well, you mustn't figure, you know.
Oh, no. I love Jesus and precious and all of them.
Dustin Hoffman and Wild Bill Hickok, reel 9. Dustin Hoffman and General Custer, reel 13.
Take my advice. Go west.
My wife, she's awful scared, isn't
My dear woman, you have nothing to fear from the Indians. I give you my personal guarantee.
For Christian America, let your arrows fly, Caballeros! I am on board!
Arthur Penn, who gave you The Miracle Worker, Bonnie and Clyde, and Alice's Restaurant, has created 15 reels of motion picture entertainment called Little Big Man.
Oh!
You devil!
Onward! To Little Big Horn!
Welcome to your new home.
So I think it's interesting that one of the criticisms of this movie is it gets some of the facts wrong. Would you be shocked? I mean, it really is all about kind of that mythos of the West, of telling stories bigger than the next story. And probably never the same story twice. because you'd always embellish it with just a little bit more. And so with that movie, let's look at another book, Johnny Guitar. As we get really ready to celebrate Women of the West, Johnny Guitar. So it was written by Ray Chancellor, who happened to also write a lot of scripts and things directly for Miss Joan Crawford. And so she bought the rights to this, went to the producers and said, here's the movie, I will star in it. We already have a director. And then they started working on the script. Now, if you look at like Internet Movie Database, it talks about how it was Philip Jordan who wrote the script. Well, he's the one that got the call last minute to supposedly fly to Sedona and rewrite the script on site so that Joan had a bigger part. It may also, in the midst of all this, even though the movie is about kind of basically people assuming or trying to direct others or control others, this movie, Philip was known to be a deal maker. So he was not only the writer of things, but he would be the front person for someone who had been blacklisted during the McCarthy era. And so that may or may not have been the case with Ben Maddow, who was supposed to have written the script, actually. So it's kind of in that whole milieu of just that Hollywood mishigas. And then you have Nicholas Ray, who was famous for probably his most famous film, Rebel Without a Cause. And again, that sense of otherness plays always in his movies about always being the outsider, never in the mainstream. As you see other movies that he did, that was a constant theme. And then we talk about music. I mean, you have the theme song with lyrics and sung by Peggy Lee. Not what you consider your typical Western movie. Now, Joan Crawford and Johnny Guitar, this movie is really about hatred of two women who kind of have their own crowd. Joan Crawford has a group of folks that around her in her casino. Meanwhile, I have Emma, who, oh, we don't want to go there yet. You have Emma, who has pretty much the whole town at her beck and call. And so let's watch the trailer. Has anyone ever seen this movie before? I was shocked by friends who were like, oh, I love Westerns. And I would mention Johnny Guitar, and they'd be like, what? And I'm like, oh, you're in for a treat. Oh, no, it didn't go. Let's see what's going on.
Too hard and wanted too much, willing to fight any odds to get it.
Down there I sell whiskey and cards. All you can buy up these stairs is a bullet in the head. Now which do you want?
Starring Joan Crawford, the screen's most dynamic artist. Sterling Hayden as Johnny Guitar. Burning with jealousy. And Scott Brady is the dancing kid.
All my life, all I ever had to do was touch a woman. She melts like butter.
How many men have you forgotten?
As many women as you remember. What took you so long?
No two men have ever loved so dangerously.
Look at him. Fingers just itching on the trigger. I can't wait to shoot me.
No two women ever hated so viciously.
I'm going to kill you if I don't kill you first.
Acclaim Pictures. Starring Joan Crawford, Sterling Hayden, Mercedes McCambridge, and Scott Brady, with Ward Bond, John Carradine, and Ben Cooper. Daringly dramatic, thrillingly exciting. In gorgeous true color by Consolidated.
Get it over with, Pete.
What do you say, Mr. McIvers?
Maybe we ought to what?
Nothing.
All right.
I can't. Not a woman.
I'll give $100. You'll have to do it yourself, Emma.
Oh my gosh, such action-packed. And from mainly that antagonist of two women, their love triangle. I mean, so ideally, Emma is in love with the dancing kid. Joan or Vienna had an affair with the dancing kid, but earlier had been with Johnny Guitar, who was a pseudonym because he was really a famous gunslinger that had given up that way of life until suddenly he gets the call saying, I'm in trouble. I mean, this movie, I think, is so full of so many dichotomies. I didn't realize that in the mid-2000s, it made its way to Broadway. So guess what's on its way? The cast recording is on its way to my house as we speak right now. I mean, it had great lines that you heard, some of which, but like, down there I sell whiskey and cards. All you can buy up these stairs is a bullet in the head. Now, which do you want? One of Vienna's staff makes a comment, never seen a woman who was more of a man. She thinks like one, acts like one, and sometimes make me feel like I'm not. Now, it was full of drama because Joan and Mercedes couldn't stand each other. Joan was furious and actually wound up throwing her costumes out on the highway in Sedona. And that's why she called for the last-minute script rewrite to make her part bigger and bigger. It also was just one of those movies that really, I think, used women's fashion, because at the time, it would have been, you would have had lots of large dresses, things that would have made it hard to ride a horse. But here you have Vienna or Joan Crawford in very tight-fitting things, so she could hop on her horse at a moment's notice and ride off in the sunset, which it sounds like from her character she had done before. And it really, you know, when you look at the West, all we hear about are mainly the men. But you know, there were women around. In some cases, they wielded lots of power, as well as money. In some cases, possibly some of the most money in town because of the brothels they ran. And so that gave them a unique perspective on society. So you know, since I've been talking about this movie to friends, we're going, I've never seen it. So now we're gonna hold a viewing party and show this movie because I think it shows such a different take on a Western with a touch of humanity. So are there any questions or any comments? So I know you had said you have seen Johnny Guitar. What did you think of it? I mean, because it's so unlike most other Westerns out there.
I think the way it was shot was interesting. The scenes, and the characters, the strong female characters for that time. And there was a strong feminist theme running through it that you didn't see back then. And it was interesting and I had not seen it either. We just actually showed it for the auxiliary for the museum.
Oh wow, I didn't realize that. Okay.
We showed just a few weeks ago, and it was really interesting. And the backstory I found it interesting, the backstory of the hatred between Joan Crawford and Mercedes McCambridge, and they had to shoot at different times of the day.
Right.
So I was interested also in the backstory, but the film itself I thought it was really interesting. It's not a super uplifting film, but yeah, I mean, they're hanging Joe Crawford in it. That was hanging a woman. That was a big thing, you know. So it was breaking barriers.
Well, and also it played such, I mean, it's like the song Johnny Guitar shows up in video games. The burning of the building shows up in a variety of then like Bonanza and other shows. So it's so funny that's been repurposed and shows up in other places as well. So it kind of has this unique perspective of just pop culture and then it lives on. And I think that's the thing, it's like we just did a panel up in Cottonwood talking about movies. And one of the things was, it's like, you know, Westerns typically tell an old story. And in order to move forward, how do we do that? And so I think that'll be one of the things that moves as we move forward. You have the film school from ASU opening up in Mesa that's going to expose a whole new group of young folks to the scenery of Arizona. Because movies that were shot in Sedona, you could never shoot again because now it's grown so big. But there is still tons of landscape. There's still tons of stories. On Happy Hour just a couple weeks ago, we actually had Douglas Miles, who was Carlos' resident and indigenous artist. We just had the Herd Museum Indian Market Days. So I think it's an interesting time where you can have new stories. I mean, you have basically indigenous cinema is now skyrocketing in terms of popularity and getting recognition and telling a unique story. And that's what I think the new Westerns will be doing, is telling new stories with new filters and new ways of doing it. But still, as we've talked about some of those antagonists, those things will still be the constant. But it'll be a whole new way of storytelling. At least I hope so.
Thank you, Marshall. You know, one of the things that just watching this reminded me as well is that one of the classic motifs of Westerns, of course, is the landscape. But it's a very particular landscape, right? It's Monument Valley, essentially. Whereas when you think about it, there are many different kinds of West. The New Mexico experience and landscape was very different than the Arizona. The same thing with California, Southern California versus Northern California. Colorado, Utah, very different landscape. But we always focus in on that kind of Monument Valley landscape. Jim, you had mentioned in your youth, Westerns were, I guess, instrumental or influential in some way. Tell us about your interest in Westerns.
Well, I was living in Los Angeles, and we didn't have all horses right outside the back door or going down the street, and so a lot of it was just the escapism, seeing places and people and situations and stories that were totally different than my experience living in Los Angeles. But strangely, when I was about 13, we moved to a place called Palos Verdes, and it's an equestrian area, and that's where I first got on a horse, and it was interesting because the people renting the horses, they didn't check out the kids, they just said, oh yeah, we'll take your money, climb on the horse, go have fun, hopefully don't kill yourself. And another little side story, and then maybe we can talk about Apaches a little bit. I spent 4 years as a younger child living in Buffalo, New York, and one of the greatest things that I had every Saturday morning is to watch Happy Trails to You, Roy Rogers and Dale, and the Adventures in the 50s, and sitting in front of this little TV set in the early 50s, and the snow was piled high outside, it was freezing, and I knew that I was from Los Angeles, and that's where they had their ranch right outside of Los Angeles. Boy, I was yearning to get back there and get back into the West.
So thank you. So we have 5 trailers. Unfortunately, we can. Jim brought some DVDs, and we can get them to play with our system. At least we pull up the trailers of 5 different movies. Is there a particular one you want to start off with, or shall we just roll one and then?
Roll.
Okay, let's go roll one. Okay. All right. Okay. In a moment. Thank you. This would be a good time. There we go. All right, terrific. Let's go ahead. And let me see if I can, let's start off with Broken Arrow. There we go. This should have sound. We're not getting sound.
The bloodiest chapter in the war between the Indian and our civilization will end. Wait, something has gone wrong. What's going on? Who's that Indian? We'll find out, see if he can pick up the army. After before he starts the war all over again. We have his name now. He is Massai, and he's staging a suicidal attempt to keep Geronimo from surrendering. He hasn't a chance. We're trying to get a better look at him. That's it. Switch it over.
You want us to kill you? A sweet death, wouldn't it, Master? A warrior's death.
It looks like the end of the battle for Massai and his lovely Nalindli. But in fact, it is just the beginning. For this is the opening of one of the screen's most exciting achievements, as Burt Lancaster plays Massai in Apache. A legend of towering strength, he dared to wage a one-man war against the entire United States. An indomitable fighter. A primitive lover. With Burt Lancaster is Jean Peters as Nalindli, a woman as brave as the man she claimed for her own, defying even his cruelty for her love.
Every Indian is my enemy. I cannot kill them all. Someday they will kill me. And we will live until someday.
Time has permitted us to give you only a brief glimpse of this great picture. We promise you, man or woman, an experience in emotion and excitement seldom achieved on the screen. For never has a story of the vanishing frontier been told so powerfully, so honestly, so faithfully.
I cannot stop it. I'm the last real Apache left in all this world.
Okay, that one was Apache. I said we were going around instead. I had that wrong, unfortunately. So, I love that line of primitive lover. I think that might describe that particular movie. Jim, anything you want to share with us from about that movie?
Well, I was going to ask you the costuming that Burt wore. How authentic was that? At the shot at the very end, it looked like he was wearing one of these Western shirts with buttons on it.
Yeah. No, you're right. You're right to catch that as well. I would say the same thing. Again, these are the kind of, the earth tones that I mentioned before that is very common to Westerns. It's just these very dull colors. Where again, if we could go back in time, they would have bright red shirts and yellow pants. I mean, it was a very different kind of color scheme. But yeah, this is the way that we've thought about the Westerns. Everything kind of grounded in these earth tones. So.
The other thing that's quite interesting too that we never see in the Western movies, but was very, very common when the Indians, especially the Apaches, when they raided wagon trains and whatever the white people, they would steal, of course, their clothing. And what would they do with the clothing? They would wear the clothing. They would wear it proudly. And so you would see these warriors with these crazy women's hats that they really loved. And they would wear the hats when they were raiding, and naturally it was something that they were proud of. But of course, if we ever saw that in one of the Hollywood Westerns, we would think, that's very, very, very strange.
Good point. All right, so let's go ahead and roll Broken Arrow. And let me pull this back here. There we go.
Where you see me riding. Since getting out of the Union Army, I've been prospecting for gold off and on. One day I got a message that a new colonel had come to Tucson and wanted to see me. The story started when I saw some buzzards circling in the sky. Buzzard's a smart bird. Something or somebody was getting ready to die. I figured it was a hurt deer or a rabbit or a snake. Not a rabbit, not a deer. His kind was more dangerous than a snake. He was an Apache. For 10 years we'd been on a savage war with his people, a bloody, no-give, no-take war. Drink. Better slow.
I've killed you before.
I knew it was dangerous to keep a fire going in Apache country, but the boy's wounds were badly infected and he was running a high fever. He had 8 pieces of buckshot in his back, and I had to dig every one of them out with my knife. I could hear him grinding his teeth together, but he never let out a sound. For the next few days I panned the stream for gold and kept an eye on the boy. I wanted to be on the move, and I was glad he was getting his strength back quickly.
This particular movie is available on YouTube, so that was just a clip I wanted to show in terms of how the Apache is represented on this one. What I appreciate about this movie, though, is it illustrates that relationships were not always hostile. Even though James Stewart's character is a stereotypical cowboy and the Apache is a stereotypical Apache, it does represent something that was actually accurate. They weren't always at each other's throats. They helped one another when occasion necessitated. And so it was a more complicated relationship between whites and Apaches, if you will. So I appreciate, that's one of the reasons why I selected that particular clip. Was there anything you wanted to share about Broken Arrow?
Well, I think the boy in there, he looks Indian. He looks like a native. Yeah. He's not clearly a pale face with a lot of makeup on.
Yeah, no, I don't know about that actor, but yeah, I mean, it's possible that...
I don't know the actor either, but and the moccasins, they look pretty real. And yeah, the other thing that's sort of interesting about the Apaches is we typically see them in the movies on horseback. And of course, they were fairly proficient, not as proficient as the Comanche, who were the lords of the plains with their horses. But the funny thing about both of the tribes is that they traveled oftentimes on foot, and they were incredibly adept at traveling very long distances just without horses. And we don't see that often. But yeah, I really like this movie. This is one of my favorites, and I love Jimmy Stewart. He's terrific, and he made so many westerns that people aren't really aware of, because he, of course, was a big star and made lots and lots of other movies.
Yeah, so one thing I would point out as well is that this is, what was common to Apaches is that Apaches would often travel over the rocky ground. They would travel down in the valley, certainly not in river streams, because you leave tracks there. So they would often travel over the more arduous route on top. So that was a little bit of a flaw, if you will. But nonetheless, it gives us an opportunity to meet this character and then have this interaction.
Now, there's a story that I think is kind of interesting. You talk about the interaction between Apaches and white people. During the Civil War, Apaches ruled the West because, of course, the U.S. Army, they were busy fighting the Confederates, and so it was wide open territory. But there was a story, and actually some films made of the story about Sam Kitchen. Do you know that one? He was a Texas rancher, and he was one of the very, very few ranchers in Texas during the war who was able to get along with the Apaches and live there and thrive. And of course, all the rest of them were booted out or slaughtered or just had to leave. Yeah, it was really, really quite interesting. He figured out a way, of course, to get along and to trade and to and negotiate. Yeah, it's a famous story that you might check out.
Thank you for that. So let's go and move over to, I want to go over to Taza, son of Cochise. This is the one I was mentioning before. And I think this is a clip that I have as opposed to just the trailer. So this is Rock Hudson as Taza, son of Cochise. Okay.
I must go back to the village. My father will be worried.
Soon you will be my worry. Not Gray Eagles. Do we talk peace? Or do I ride with Geronimo? Hear him out, Jim.
Sorry, I didn't mean to laugh. All right, so that is a trailer. There we go. Okay, sorry. So I didn't mean to here. So here's one of the things that is so typical about Westerns, right? Is that how do you know the Apaches are there? Is that suddenly you look up and lining the cliff walls are all the warriors standing, right, with their rifles. That was not the Apache way. The Apache really specialized in stealth. And so you rarely ever saw them, and that was on purpose. They were masters at camouflage. So they would never stand up there and just fire at you. I mean, they would fire from a hidden position, which is one of the reasons why it was so difficult for the American troops to actually fight with them, is because they were very well hidden, and they knew the rocks and the landscape far better than most Americans. So that
they didn't play by the rules.
Yeah, it was their rules, right?
They were the original guerrilla fighters.
Yes, exactly. So you wouldn't see a scene like that. And of course, the other thing that made me laugh, just chuckle, was Rock Hudson. He had this painted Z on his chest or something like that, which again you would not see. But it was just one of the ways in which Hollywood was representing, a primitive. What was that last line? Was it a primitive lover? A primitive individual. Even the ways in which they speak, right? I mean, they can't just say, "Hi, my name is Taza," right? It's more stereotypical meet Taza kind of thing, right? Anything you want to say about this one?
Well, of course, the speech, we could go into that, and that would be interesting a little bit. But the Apaches, very, very often, the language that they used to communicate with Americans was Spanish, because they loved to raid into Mexico, steal the horses, grab whatever they could, and then head back across the border. So they played that game. But they, for some reason, were more interested. Maybe it was probably easier for them to learn Spanish, and so that was really the language of communication between American whites and the Apaches to a great degree, and we don't see that. I wanted to say one other comment too, and we didn't see it in this, but one of the tropes that is so typical in cowboy Indian Western movies is when Indians attack the forts, right? And they come in, lots of warriors, of course, and then they ride around the fort, or they race up, or they try and climb the walls, and they're attacking the forts, and they're being picked off like shooting fish in a barrel. And that never happened. Of course it didn't happen, because the Apaches weren't stupid. They would wait for an opportunity to attack when they weren't noticed, and they would pick off the soldiers, and they were very, very clever warriors. They never attacked straight on. That's a European style, going after the walled cities and the rest of it, which is completely ridiculous. And one other comment that I'd love to mention, just because it's one of my favorites, it has nothing to do really with Apaches, but what do you see in almost all of the Western movies when it's just cowboys? There's a gunfight, okay? And how do they operate the gunfight? There are rules to gunfighting. And you go into the street and you separate yourself, and then you wait for the other guy to start drawing his gun, and then you shoot, and then the way. That never happened. Never, 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 ever happened. Completely a fabrication of the early Westerns. We talk about these fabrications that just continue, and as viewers, we tend to think, gee, I've seen it so often. It must have happened. That must be realistic. Anyway.
Oh no, go on, you're absolutely right.
I mean, all those tourists in Tombstone would be shocked to hear that.
So here's why it never happened, is because, again, going back to your premise that people aren't stupid, if you face off against someone else who also has a weapon, you could die. And you don't want to do that. And so often what was the way of killing each other was to shoot each other in the back in the Old West.
That's absolutely true, or use shotguns, because that was much, much more effective. But yes, there were lots of gunfights, and it tended to be rage, and they were spontaneous, and oftentimes in the saloons. But the planned dual sort of process.
I'm calling you out, kind of stuff, right?
Complete total fabrication.
Yeah, wonderful. All right, so I think in the time that we have left, you mentioned Spanish. Thank you for that. I do want to do this. If we could jump forward, and let me see if I can walk and chew gum at the same time. I wanted to roll this clip from one of my favorite Westerns. It's called The Missing, which is a remake of The Searchers. And one of the reasons why I love this is that Ron Howard directed this, and they worked very, very hard to get things right. So even the actors learned a particular Apache dialect that is found on the San Carlos Reservation. They were on site to film. And so they worked to get it right. And there's a scene I want to share with you where Kate Blanchett is playing the daughter. Her name is Magdalena, or Maggie. Her father, Tommy Lee Jones, comes into her life after being absent for about 20 years or so. He lived among the Chiricahua, so he's dressed like one. And so there's this estrangement that exists between Kate Blanchett and Tommy Lee Jones. Now the scene that I want to roll for you is, I love it so much as a historian because it's so layered with historical accuracy. They are on the way to find a daughter, Kate Blanchett's daughter, who has been kidnapped, and on their way to Mexico. You mentioned Mexico as well. So there's a group of Apache raiders with white men working together to kidnap white girls, go down to Mexico and sell them, right? So Kate Blanchett and Tommy Lee Jones, they're chasing after Tommy Lee Jones' granddaughter and Kate Blanchett's daughter, okay? They rest for the night at a ruin, which was probably either a Rio Salado or Hohokam ruin. So there's that, which I appreciate. There's that layer that there was an ancient, even more ancient native presence. So they rest for the night. Kate Blanchett becomes ill. And so the clip that I want to show for you is a clip where Tommy Lee Jones and his companion, his Comanche companion, are praying over her native style. The little girl is reciting Psalms 23 or 22, I can't remember which one. They're trying to heal her. And what I love about this, oh, and the last thing is you will see a brujo. So this is common in the native thought world. There is an existential battle between good and evil that's playing out. And there are people who access evil forces, brujos, witches, and they can do all kinds of nasty things to you. And there are good forces as well. So this is kind of a common traditional native way of thinking about the world that we exhibit, or that we inhabit. That there are evil forces out there that can be accessed, but there are also powers that we can use. And so often in native art, for example, many of you are familiar with turquoise among the Navajo. Turquoise has spiritual power. That's why the necklaces are so, there's so many things around the wrist as well, that the turquoise is a protectant, right? It's a shield of kind, right? So this is why Navajos wear that. There are sacred colors also that are associated. So Tommy Lee Jones tries to put this sacred thing on here. And I just want to roll this clip because I love it. They're speaking in Spanish to begin with. Back to Jim's point, that's absolutely true. Spanish was the lingua franca. It was the common language that everyone spoke. It allowed native people to communicate with each other because their languages were very different. It allowed them to communicate with whites. It allowed them to communicate, of course, with Mexicans as well. So you'll see the scene where they're speaking to each other. Kate Blanchett is speaking to the Comanche friend of Tommy Lee Jones in Spanish. There's subtitles, so don't worry about this. But I love it as a story because this was so true. This is one movie that I think that got this one right. So let me see if I can do this. I think this is it. Yes, all right, let's see if we can get this.
Just give me that mezcal. All right, don't hurt. Tranquilo. Sí.
So that was in Spanish, tranquilo, that is be calm.
Na pusat ngende cek eslikan intervista site
Dura, tate, shikachi, zisling ipa.
He told me this Brujo's mother was raped by a witch. Came out of her womb 2 years later with a full 17.
I'm not feeling too good myself. Don't sit too close, John. I'm not feeling too good. So cold.
It's not that cold, Mom.
¿Hablas español? Gracias a mi padre, el viejo.
Sí.
¿Qué recuerdas de él?
Se llama Chano Pao Zidane.
el cazador.
Yeah. He was.
Casó con Mazzini, mujer Chiricahua.
Bonita. Era bonita.
Tenía un ojo cruzado. Él vive con Navajo cuando ella murió de viruela. Él nunca al mismo lugar, Chado Baoitzdan. Espíritu inquieto no hace al hombre feliz.
Su mujer chica.
Amarás todas, por un tiempo.
What are you doing?
I'm dreaming of what's gonna happen tomorrow.
Can I dream on it too?
I don't know, can you?
Mama's talking in her sleep again.
These different ways of thinking about life, about power, that are coming into play. All, again, these different people, different cultures trying to help one another, which to me is also an accurate representation of the West. It was not as confrontational as what our Westerns often make it out to be. People tried to get along. Of course, there were moments of conflict, but that's one of the things I appreciate about this. Again, it was the Spanish that was used as the common language, and all of these different kind of spiritual worlds coming into play to help her heal when she eventually heals. If you haven't seen the movie, I love it. It's, again, I appreciate their efforts to try and be historically accurate. We're very close to ending our time, so let me do this. Let me go around. We'll start, Marshall. You have any final comments or any thoughts about the West and about Apaches?
So I'm so glad we ended with this, because I think it also shows that Hollywood is trying to get away from that Max Factor red that he created just so that all the pale faces could play indigenous folks. And so I'm so glad to see that Hollywood, as well as independent cinema, is progressing and telling stories in a different way than what they did, to try to be more factual and more human.
Thank you for that. Jim, any final thoughts you want to share about Westerns and about Apaches?
Well, based upon what I just saw in the movie, you were, of course, focusing on what was important in this movie, and I love the movie, by the way. It's very intense. It's not the typical Hollywood Western in any form or fashion, but I noticed the saddles that they used, and I really liked that for the Anglo riders, because they looked authentic. They were the Spanish style saddle instead of the more modern saddles. They had a higher cantle and pommel, and yeah, very, very distinctive. The other thing about saddles that I think is important to always be aware of when you're watching any Western movie, when you see Indians on horseback, the very first thing that I look for to see if there's any verisimilitude in this movie that's being produced is whether the Indians are in a saddle, and what they typically did, because bareback riders, they're much less common than people who can ride in a saddle. And so they would throw the stupid blanket over the saddle and to disguise the saddle, and then you see the Indians running around, but it's clear that they're in a saddle. No, they were bareback riders always, and very, very adept at that.
Thank you for that. So just to wrap things up again, back to our exhibition here, and we worked with our Native Advisory Committee to help us tell a more accurate story. This is really what we tried to do here. And we're ending up on this note as well, that, you know, just as Hollywood has produced these images of the stereotypical Apache or Indian, we are trying to tell a more complicated story, one that is more honest. And as Marshall mentioned as well, is that we're in a day now where I think most Hollywood productions try to be more authentic, more accurate than what we saw coming out of the Golden Age. As great as those stories were, but you just have to remember, you're not looking at history, you're looking at a representation to tell us a particular story. So with that, we will end, and let me just throw out, are there any questions for anything that we've examined for our comments? Yes? Yeah. Yes. Yes, so Spanish was the common language that allowed everybody in the West to communicate with each other. And that's not often represented in the Westerns that we see. Yes, that's correct. They did. Yes, that they spoke Spanish in addition to their native language. And that's what allowed them to communicate with whites and with other native tribes as well, was actually Spanish. Yeah, but that's one historical truth that is rarely represented in the movies. That's one of the reasons why I love this movie so much. Yeah, okay, terrific. Yes, comment back here.
Yeah, you said that the Westerns were morality plays.
Yeah.
So what would their predecessor be in Western culture, European culture, as morality plays?
So for those who study Westerns, they tie them back to what's called the knight-errant tale. You had mentioned the medieval period as well, that idea of kind of surrounding a fort and trying to climb the walls. All the way back to medieval European literature, there was a genre of literature that was known as the knight-errant tale. So in other words, it was a good person, a knight, who is on an errand. And along that journey, they encounter all kinds of things, right? And so as far as a genre of telling stories, scholars of literature have tied our Westerns back to that medieval tradition of telling stories. So in other words, it's a good individual going through a series of adventures on their way to finish some mission that they were set out to do.
So
Yes?
that's kind of like Joseph Campbell's hero stories then?
Yes, there's some elements to that. Yes, to Joseph Campbell's work and his exploration of the hero story. Yeah, there's some elements to that as well. I would add one other thing as well, is that one of the common themes that we find in Westerns is redemption. And indeed, you will find that in this particular movie, redemption, Tommy Lee Jones's character comes to redeem himself. He had abandoned his daughter, and some 20 years had passed, and in trying to find his granddaughter who has now been kidnapped, he winds up redeeming himself, but it's often through self-sacrifice. So redemption is another theme that we find through many of our Westerns. So that moves it then on to the kind of the level of exploring morality, right? And that's what's one of the reasons why I think Westerns are so fascinating to us. All right, any other comments before we go? All right, thank you so much for your attention.